Welcome to MyLife, Chassidus Applied, episode 7. First, response to some of the emails that have been coming in, both in reaction to what has been discussed here in previous episodes, as well as new questions. So I want to just preface that there have been a number of questions that have been quite heart-wrenching, and I don't feel yet appropriate to necessarily speak about this in these MyLife episodes. So I do want to say, if anyone has a particular issue, especially one that just came in to me, please email me to my personal email address. And that's SIMON, my name, Simon, at meaningfullife.com. And we can discuss it further. I'll be happy to talk about this in personal one-on-one, either on phone or whatever else other way we can communicate. But meanwhile, many other questions I will address and continue to come in. And I'd like to continue a topic that I began last week, which was what we call the unspoken impulse. But first, a few comments in response to that, to put things into context. The reason I'm continuing the subject is because not all aspects were covered completely, and I saw from some of the questions that some things should be clarified even more. So to read a few of the questions. Thank you so much for this amazing class, episode 6. I can say that I felt the shlemus that you were mentioning, and I was referring to that talk, the sikha from the Rebbe Rashav and Tafrei Shayin Gimmel, Yutas Kislev, about shlemus, which we'll talk about some more, and in general in all your classes of MyLife. I'm so grateful that you took upon yourself to do such a thing. It is very much needed and talks to my heart deeply. I knew that all the answers are in Chassidus. Thanks for proving it to me in such evident way. Thanks again, and Hashem should bless you with all the brachas and give you the koyach to continue. So thank you very much for the vote of confidence. In a similar question, a similar comment, I am a bocher, and I want to thank you for teaching me something I never got in the system or from my parents. I'm crying inside that you have finally released a lot of pain that I was feeling inside regarding this issue. Thank you. Please don't stop giving classes. We need them. Yet another, can you please focus on bochrim? You're focusing too much on marriage, and our issues are not getting addressed. I'm sure you know what we desire, and having a good in different areas, and having a good time, and no one to speak to, and I don't trust the mashpiyim. I feel like no one really cares about me. Yet another, and thank you very much. You have taken a very heavy stone from my heart I was never able to deal with. I will start learning Chassidus much more and substitute that for my other pleasures. Thank you for all your great shiurim. I thought you answered my question regarding chen very well. I would just like to sum it up as follows. It is true that it's very difficult due to our surroundings. Number 2, the greater the test is testament to the graveness of the matter. Number 3, the idea that Chassidus can empower the person and replace the desire is very empowering. I just wanted to give you some feedback since I see that you were continuing to do this in part 2. Real nice job last week. And then 2 questions regarding this issue. How is chatas nurim, how is chen defined? Is this something that if it happens by accident during sleep or something intentionally while awake? And then this writer continues, and I don't want to read it because it's too explicit, about how he learned to control the impulse. But the bottom line is, how do I maintain myself from doing this intentionally? And finally, how does one work on self-control in thought, speech, and action? As much as I know I need to control myself in certain areas, every time a situation comes up, it just doesn't work. I always say the next time will be better, but it isn't. Knowing the problem is half the cure, and I've also spoken to Mashpim about it, so why can't I just do it? I feel like it's totally beyond my control sometimes. And then there was one additional question, since I had talked about preemptive measures. 2 people asked the question, or a few more than 2, but 2 specifically, educate our children about sexuality. Please specify it about what age we are speaking about. Kids, when and how to teach kids about the birds and the bees. So, punching all of this together, I will try to, in a summation type of fashion, address this further, without necessarily repeating everything that was said, and try to answer some of these specific questions. Clearly, this is an issue that's not just going away due to one talk or two talks. The Rabbeim and the Rebbe specifically wrote many letters about it, and clearly it's a challenge. But I thought it was appropriate to just read the actual letter that the Rebbe wrote to many, many people to begin with. And then I'll apply that more specifically. So the letter exists in many places. Actually, I want to thank one particular individual who sent me the personal letter the Rebbe wrote to him. He says he never revealed it to anyone, but he felt it appropriate on this forum that I should read it without obviously any names. So this is a letter that you'll find many different versions of it, but very often, because almost word for word. So there is, an answer to your letter, about this, the Inyan HaYadua, we talk the Chet HaYadua sometimes, this so-called the unspoken impulse. Yadua Eitza Yu'utza, it's known, the Eitza Yu'utza, the advice given to advise on this, Hesach Hadas, which we shall discuss in a moment, which means literally to distract yourself from it. Hesach, to remove your thought from it. The intention here does not mean a war with your thought, because that means that you're not pushing away. You're concentrating and fighting with it. So it doesn't mean a thought, a war with a bad thought or the non-good thought. But to remove your thought. In order to make it easier to remove your mind from it, Yasik as kolma, yaimik, I should say, as koyach hamachshava be'inyan acher, you should concentrate your power of your thought in something else, she'en lo shayches klal, that has no relationship at all, l'teichen hamachshava le'teva, to the content of this negative thought, or this thought that is not a good thought. Umatev, and preferably, to concentrate on words of Torah and tefillah prayer. And if a little light dispels a lot of darkness, definitely much light. So, being that this is a letter that the Rebbe has written, I didn't read the entire letter, even though I gave over part of it. I just thought it's important to emphasize and discuss this a little more in depth. The meaning of the Rebbe's suggestion. So very clear that this Chet HaYadua, Evan Yadua, is absolutely unacceptable. However, it's an assign, it's a test that comes. And with all the rejection of it, we have to have a way to approach it. So by contrast, there is an approach, which is not the approach the Rebbe is emphasizing, an approach without mentioning different chugim, different movements and different philosophies among Jews that focus on battling with it, like the Rebbe is negating here, focusing on it and battling, going to war with this thought, with these thoughts, with these impulses. The Rebbe writes in another letter, it's in volume 22 of the Igres, the Rebbe writes that someone writes to the Rebbe that he says Tehillim at night in order to prevent or to repair this issue, this challenge, this impulse. Incidentally, someone wrote to me, maybe not, that shouldn't be unspoken impulse, it should be unspoken desire. Well, whatever you prefer. And the Rebbe negates and says that by saying Tehillim in connection to this sin, that itself is opposite of Hesach Hadas. So it's very clear that there's another approach that Chassidus Chabad negates, starting from the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Rebbe takes it to an entirely different level, because even if someone intentionally, because this is not just inadvertently, intentionally was transgressed and was nichshal, as they say, slipped in this particular sin, the approach is not to concentrate how to repair it, not to agonize over it, not over the matter itself, and not even over its tikkun, not to say Tehillim about it or other things, but simply to go and move your mind elsewhere. So that's clear contrast of a different approach that Chassidus Chabad does not take. So I want to talk about that some more. What exactly this means, this Hesach Hadas. So in truth, as has been pointed out to me, and I want to give credit to Rabbi Itzi Winner, Mashpia in Melbourne, who has had an extensive correspondence with me on this topic, that in essence what the Rebbe says here is really the content of chapter 12 in Tanya. So I want to read a few lines in Tanya that I think could be helpful, even though there he's not talking about necessarily this particular issue, but any temptation. So in chapter 12 in Tanya, one of the more revolutionary and I would say mind-boggling contributions of the Alter Rebbe makes a statement there which directly and starkly disagrees with much of modern psychology, especially the Freudian school. And that is the concept of Moyach Shalat Alalev. That even when inadvertent thoughts come into a person's mind, what we call hirhuri avera, things that you can't control, a human being has, and he brings from the Zohar, Pasha Pinchas, Moyach Shalat Alalev. The mind can control the heart. And he continues, B'tel dosei v'tevi yitzirosei. By our birth, which means it's our birthright. V'tevi yitzirosei. And the nature of the way we've been shaped, the way we've been created. Shekach neitzir adam b'tel dosei. All these different expressions, which itself can be studied, what the Alter Rebbe is adding, that shekach, this is the way human being was shaped b'tel dosei, which means it's not acquired, but it's inherent. Shekol adam, that every human being, yochel b'ritzeinei, can b'ritzeinei shebemeche, can with the willpower of his mind, lisapik, to control, withhold, ulimshel, to control and rule, beruach taivosei, in the spirit of of temptation, of desire, shebelibe, in his heart, shaloi lamalis mishaylas libe b'maisa dibur machshava, not to fulfill the desires, or you can say the temptations, the requests of his heart, in action, speech, and thought. And then he goes further, not just to stop it or control, lahasiach daite legamri mitayves libe, to completely remove his mind from that particular focus, move it elsewhere, mitayves libe elahepach lahasiach daite legamri mitayves libe elahepach legamri. Not just to remove it, but elahepach, he can move his mind to focus on something that's completely diametric opposite of that temptation or desire. Or befrat, which means even till here, he's already controlled it. It could be he moved his mind to think about business, to think about mathematics, to think about physics, to think about shopping, something far neutral. Ubafrat, which is completely the opposite extreme of what that temptation was, ubafrat, and specifically outside Hagdusha, that he can move his mind to something outside the Kedusha, which is something holy, learning Torah, Tefillah, a mitzvah, tzedakah, and so on. And then he says, Ukidiksiv, like it says in the Pasuk, in Kehelis, that I see that there's an advantage of wisdom over folly, like the power and dominance of light over darkness. Pirush, this means, just like light has power and dominance over darkness, that a little light dispels a lot of darkness. See how many similarities there are to the letter that I just read from the Rebbe. That are automatically and naturally dispelled. Since he compares light and darkness, folly and wisdom, the same thing, automatically, without effort, sichlis harbe, like cheshach harbe, much folly, foolishness, from the klipa sitracha, which is in the left side of the heart, which is compared, how do we know sichlus is related to the animal soul and its temptations? Because it says a person doesn't sin unless he has a ruach shtus, which is the same idea as sichlus. All that is dispelled automatically, even if it's abundance of such thoughts, or abundance of such darkness. It's dispelled in face of the light of the nefesh alikis, the chokhmah of the nefesh, the wisdom in the divine soul, in the mind, asher ritzeina limshal levada, whose desire it is to be the sole controller over the city, which is the small city, which is the human being, and going on, continues that it should be dedicated to Torah and mitzvahs. Now this piece in Tanya can be discussed at length, and here's not the place to go into a whole class in it. But number one is you see the similarity and the approach. It's critical to establish that this is not an acquired skill, it's a natural skill. Because if it was acquired, a human being naturally has thoughts about his own survival, about temptations, including sexual thoughts. So how can an acquired skill that comes through education and through conditioning dominate over a natural thought that comes inadvertently? By saying that it's B'teva tel dase, B'teva yitzadese, the Alter Rebbe is establishing that you and I have within us ingrained, just like we have natural skills that are in our arms and our legs, the natural ability to see. You don't need to be taught to look with your eyes. You don't need to be taught to chew. You don't need to be taught so many natural abilities. We do not need to be taught to have self-control. The fact that it takes time to establish it and little children don't have it is because the mind has not yet developed. But once the mind is developed, that we say bas mitzvah, 12 years old for a girl, 12, 13 years old for a boy, self-control is something that is expected and possible because it's natural to us. If you want something enough, you can control anything. And the best proof is very simple. Look at situations when a person is in a deep crisis, or they're under the gun in some other way. Suddenly, temptations go away, everything goes away because they want and need something. Suddenly you have self-control. If you would say that temptations are more powerful than you and your desire, why is it that certain times when you really apply your mind and you feel you need something, suddenly you're able to push away a temptation? Because you have the power. The only problem is you're not exercising it, or you don't have something that's interesting enough for you to fight for it. But when you have something to fight for, suddenly external things don't make, and temptations can be controlled. Does this mean it forever can be controlled in the fullest sense of the word? Obviously not, which is why there's a whole Tanya to teach us how to achieve this. So the Tanya establishes this concept of Hesach Hadas. Now, let's take this a step further. If you go further in Tanya, in chapter 14, he adds an element that because every Jew has deep inside his heart a connection to God, that can also be accessed to help a person motivate them to fight. But you have to feel that your soul is on the line. The problem with many of temptations is that we don't feel it's that significant. But when you access that, that's another element. But even moreover, when you go further in Tanya, there's yet a third step. When it comes to chapter 16 and then 17, where he talks about cognitive and emotional conditioning, it's not just impulse control. It's not just stopping it once or twice. It's training yourself to constantly focus on something else. For example, people who go and train in the army, or they train in business school, they learn after a while when you repeat something, sometimes they say 17, 18 times you repeat something, it starts becoming second nature. Hergel nasa teva. Your routine becomes your nature. Sometimes second nature is the expression. Teva sheni. But retraining and conditioning suddenly teaches a person to have instincts that automatically respond. So even though initially you wouldn't have that instinct, but once you've been trained and you've been conditioned a number of times, you suddenly just impulsively react differently. So in other words, if you have a repeated action of Hesach Hadas and you do it on a constant basis, at some point it becomes natural to you. Does that mean we'll never fall through? Not necessarily. But there's power that a human being can condition themselves. They condition themselves, as we've discussed in previous episodes, the idea of breaking a habit or assuming a new habit. Just like habits are developed, you develop good habits. And good habits means that you train yourself when something comes your way to think a different thing, to focus on something else. Obviously, all this requires willpower and requires this accessing the Moyach Shalat Alev. If we're lazy and laid back, obviously what's going to control whatever is the default state. You're bored, whatever excites you at that moment. So this requires effort, but it could be a conditioning that ultimately helps condition a person to be in this state of mind. And I could show you examples in each of our lives. When something is important, whether people go to work to make money, suddenly there's focus. Because they have a reason to focus themselves, and they will not allow themselves to be distracted for their own personal gain. So we see that human beings are fully capable, if they wish, to discipline themselves in tremendous ways. Now, additionally, I want to add that if we look into some sichos of the Rebbe, there's some additional points that the Rebbe makes, something I did not discuss. I want to talk about a sicha from Parshat Tzav, Zocher, Tavshin Yud Zayin. And additionally, a mimer v'Yakov Nosev of a Yishlach Tovshin Tezayin. There, the Rebbe cites an Alter Rebbe's mimer that had just arrived, a manuscript in those years. And the Rebbe cites something which is a fascinating insight in Hesach Hadas. Hesach Hadas, usually we think of, okay, I'm thinking about this, I move my thoughts to something else. Because obviously you can't think about nothing. He brings there that the Alter Rebbe says Hesach Hadas means not to think about yourself, to be Masir Das from yourself. Not to be Mashgiach al Atzmei, is the language in the Maimer, in Tovshin Tazayin. Which means, instead of focusing on yourself and your either obsession, or your wish to get rid of this obsession, focus on the cause. Focus on your purpose in life. Focus on God. And when you do so, the Eibishter has the ability to bring Eir and Cheshach together. That even though we have a Nefesh Abamis and an animal soul, at the same time, the Eibishter's Nesa Hafchim, he could also bring light even though you have not yet transformed yourself. So Hesach Hadas takes on a different meaning, a deeper meaning. It's not a contradiction to what we're reading here. Hesach Hadas means that stop focusing on yourself so much. I just saw a note from the Rebbe to someone that the Iker, I don't know what was a response to, but he writes, the Iker, the primary thing, Lasiach das von sich, you should stop thinking about yourself, at least for several weeks. Why several weeks, I'm not sure, but I guess it's maybe half humorous, half serious. The Rebbe is saying, after several weeks, I guess if you could stop thinking about yourself for several weeks, if someone said several months, if the Rebbe had said several months, several years, that would be a little too overwhelming, too formidable. Several weeks, and then you take it from there. The idea of focusing not on yourself and focusing on the cause. I once told somebody who asked me, he said, what is really a chassid? Chabad chassid. I said, Chabad chassid doesn't take himself seriously, he takes the cause seriously. Other people, they take themselves seriously and they don't take the cause that seriously. Which means not to overlook our flaws. We all have our flaws. But not to become consumed with it. Not to become consumed in doing it, and not to become consumed, look how terrible I am, that I am an animal and I have my thoughts and temptations. Don't be so nispal. Don't get so excited about yourself. There's a big God, he put you on this earth. He put you on this earth and he knew very well their temptations. Like he says in that Perek 12 in Tanya, Hirhuri Aveda, thoughts of sin, all temptations, are things we cannot control. They pop up. Think of it like a pop-up on the pop-up ad on a computer. I hope some people know what that is. I hope most of you don't know what that is. But in case you do, a pop-up ad. But then once it pops up, the question is, are you going to dwell on it? Or are you going to just exit? Get rid of it. So God knows all that. Don't take yourself that seriously. Lahasiyach das means don't focus on yourself, focus on the kavanah. Which of course means move your mind over to something which is connected to the purpose of your life. If you have a purpose and you connect to that purpose, it's the best eir that's deicha har b'cheshach. I want to add one more thing since we're already on the topic. And that is that in essence, that Tzemach Tzedek also says this in the letter that I quoted in episode 5, where we talked about not to concentrate on negative thoughts. So Tzemach Tzedek says that, and he brings proofs from Nigla and from different Sfarim, that a person has the ability to control their fears. He brings one of the proofs where the Torah says when you go to war, it should be a person who doesn't have fear. How could you make such a condition? Because he says a person has control. And he actually says, how do we know we have that? What's the reason of the control? He says, that a person has control. He says, all emotions are sustained by concentration. Das is called the key. The key that encompasses all the 6 emotions. And how does concentration manifest in feelings? It's through focus, concentration of your mind, your thoughts. He's giving us some of the dynamic. And that's why by removing your thought from this focus, you're essentially the key to awakening emotions, to sustaining emotions, is taken away. You're taking away their energy. That memela creates a hesach hadas, a distraction from the feeling. And and then the midah does not get awakened, and it's if it didn't exist. And then he goes on to speak about actually thoughts connected to niyuv, connected to things that are bias asuris and so on, connected to sexuality, inappropriate sexuality. That yes, you cannot control the hirur. A thought pops up, but the das, you have a key. The key is in your hand, the concentration. Now, that requires effort, but you can control that key and you control the flow of whether the emotion will be fed or it will not be fed. And then he goes on to speak about how even if you're not in the mood, you also have to act that way. If you recall, we said that actions bring to feelings. And I want to add something since we're on it. Chassidic actually brings a personal story. It's a fascinating story. It was one of the last, maybe the last thing the Alter Rebbe said, B'chaim Chayusei, on this earth. In this letter, the Chassidic cites it. So we all know the Alter Rebbe was running away because of the war. This was Tov Kuf Ayin Gimmel. This will be the last days of the Alter Rebbe's life. Shabbos was that last Shabbos. Motzei Shabbos, Chavdal Tevis, is when the Istalkus of the Alter Rebbe was. Tzemach Tzedek was with the Alter Rebbe during the Istalkus, and he actually writes a Rishim about it. The Rebbe brings it in different sichas. Now, the Tzemach Tzedek says that davening Ma'ariv, the Alter Rebbe was already not well, and clearly it was a very sad moment. So he davened Ma'ariv, he says, with a very Moresh Cheder Dikatun, a very depressing and painful tune, recognizing what the Alter Rebbe was at his last breaths. He says the Alter Rebbe waited till he finished davening Ma'ariv, and then called him over and told him this Torah from the Maggid. He said that the Maggid told him, and I'm reading here what he writes: Shamaiti mipeh kodesh shel kved amur, which would mean, in other words, they're talking about the Alter Rebbe. B'Piyena, that was Kfar Piyena, the city of Piyena, where they were those last days. She'omer b'zeh loshen. Asher kach hoya harava Maggid emer al posek kamara even sapir v'al dmus akisei dmus kamara adam. That the Maggid, which was the teacher of the Alter Rebbe, said on the posek of Even Sapir, that al dmus akisei, and the image of the throne is the image of a man. Shekefi hamidah she'odam mara lo mata maran le milmayla. That according to the midah, the emotion that a person shows below, that's how there's a reaction from above. Action, reaction, cause and effect. And that's why he stopped me. After the fact, he told me they should not sing a song Moresh Cheder. He says, because that Smaitiv, I sang that way, because he waited till I finished, and then he told me this. This is maybe the last thing the Alter Rebbe said in this world. You see from this a direct directive that how we behave actually affects our emotions below and above, to that extent. Then just want to add one more thing. The Alter Tzedek says again, this is it has a certain humor to it as well. He says, if you really want to be Mekayim, the mitzvah of worry and concern, ten lo mekaymo, haroyelo, give it its appropriate place. And what is that? Who Maimon Azal says, Ein Mason Rosei Teira lemisha li b'deig b'kirbe. That they don't give secrets of Torah except to someone who's concerned and has anxiety in his heart. So he's basically saying, take your anxiety. You want anxiety? Don't be anxious over negative things. Don't be anxious about these issues as well of the undesired impulse, and transfer it into worrying about discovering Primus HaTeira. It says, you do amazing, and that's Nechamti, he says, and that will bring you Simcha and Nechama. One final thing I want to say about this, I know I'm elaborating more than usual, but I think it's important, and that is, the language in Tanya is Harotzen Shebemeach Shebelev. Harotzen Shebemeach, rather, I should say. The language the Alter Rebbe uses is Yochel B'Retzeinei Shebemeiche L'Yisapek Limshel B'Ruach Tevosei. What's the B'Retzeinei Shebemeiche? So the simple interpretation is, because he's talking there about thoughts that come inadvertently, not B'Retzeinei, so he's saying, you have a part of, in your mind, also a power of a willpower to control thoughts by not dwelling on them. But I thought maybe one can add, Yesh Lema B'Derech Hefsher, something, a powerful thing, and this is based on the Torah Shalom that I had referred to, And I say again, we put up the links of the Torah Shalom as additionally another talk I gave on this topic, which elaborates on this even further. And that is a point that he makes there, that in order to, when a person has, for example, a wound on a finger or a small thing, a Band-Aid or another thing can repair it. But when there is a violation of one's own sexuality, which is the core, what he calls the shleimus ha'adam, or the atzmi of the adam, he says the repair has to come from within itself. It can't come from another force. It has to come from within itself. And what is that? He says it's not shuva even. It is the power of pnimis haTorah. So what the Tzemach just said here, it's the power of pnimis haTorah, rozeh Torah. How do you explain that? So if you look at Ayin Beis, Hemshech Ayin Beis, chapters 192 and on, especially chapter 203 and so on, he says a major chiddush from the Alter Rebbe about this topic. What does he say there? He says that the mind, intellect, chokhmah, is really tainug. We see intellect as being an intellectual comprehension process. In truth, it all begins with shashuyim, God's pleasures and delights. That in turn turns into chokhmah, into wisdom. Without going into an explanation, he basically is saying that the pleasure, the core pleasure of the divine, manifests in chokhmah. That's we have pnimius abba, pnimius atik. That the mind brings such profound pleasure. And he says that's specifically through pnimius haTorah. The inner dimension of Torah really captures that idea more than anything else. Because the inner dimension of Torah is rooted in Atik, like he brings in the Yonashal Torah Chassidus. It's a Ir Chodosh from Atik. So Torah, which is Shashim Lafon of delights, the innermost delights of the divine, the deepest pleasure, turns into Chokhmah. So what is the key to the whole sexual impulse? It's all about the mind. The tipa comes from the mind. The arousal and the stimulation and the temptation is ultimately depends on focus of the mind. So if you're able to go into the engine room of the mind and generate from pleasure of pnimius haTorah, which is the root of it all, and channel it through learning Torah, as he says there in the Rebbe's letter, that your whole mind should be consumed with what you're learning. And you allow the learning to submerge yourself in it, to the point that you push a lexich the finger, your nefesh habamis even your animal soul enjoys understanding Chassidus. That is the key to changing something at the core root in the shleimus, in the atzmi, and that in turn is the ultimate antidote to the taiva that comes also from pleasure and turns into wisdom. The pleasure that's connected, the pleasure principle in Klippa, that's so much part of the temptation dealing with sexuality. So basically that is the ultimate antidote to this process. Much more can be said about this. I'll suffice with this. I will also add that in Yutas Kislev Tafrei Samaches, in Torah Shalom, the Rebbe Rashab discusses, the famous sikha there, how the chiddush of the Alter Rebbe with Chassidus Chabad was that even someone who's not on any particular high level, and someone who's not even mezuchach and refined, can understand godliness. And in Likutei Diburim, Simchas Torah, Tafrei Tzadik Zayin, Volume 2, in Likutei Diburim, the long sikha with Rab Hillel, who said Chassidus taught him, he thought his body was his enemy. And Chassidus taught him that his body is mepsari echzalekah. From your body we can perceive, from my flesh I perceive godliness. So ultimately, and as the Rebbe Rashab says in that sikha, his famous story, he rolled up his arm and said, for this arm, this flesh, God poured out the whole Torah mitzvahs, atzmus, in this flesh. So flesh can be used in a very negative way, but it's rooted in the deepest levels up above, all the way in Atik. How do you get it going? You can't do it through the flesh because the flesh is too powerful. Pnimius haTorah goes right into the core engine room, into the core source of it all, and learning Chassidus with pleasure, in a way that mamish geschmack, even geschmack that completely consumes you, is a force that weakens the other power, that the shleimus is fought with shleimus. Okay. Let's move on to next topic. The next topic is judgmentalism. Judgmentalism, and here's the question that I would like to talk about. One person writes like this: on one hand, Hashem gave each of us our own unique mission in the world and abilities with which to carry it out. On the other hand, we live in a community and there's a mitzvah to conform to norms. But to what extent? And we find people who live in strong communities and have strong opinions, and what they do is they judge others. The question is there room for judgmentalism, and how do we avoid judgmentalism? Another questioner asks a similar question. I find myself always judging other people. I find myself criticizing others and focusing always on the negative. I do this with my family members, and I do it also with friends and others. Is there something in Chassidus that teaches us how to deal with judgmentalism? Well, it's interesting. I'm right now teaching in Ayin Beis. The chapters in Ayin Beis talk about chapters 231 that talk about two types of self-esteem. It talks there about eminence and esteem. And it's a fascinating study which literally answers this question and helps a person deal with it. Why do we judge another person? We judge other people because we're insecure. A person who's very secure has no reason to judge another. Now, of course, you'll say, what do you mean? I judge another because God says that person is doing something wrong and that person should be judged. So there's a maimer in Derech Mitzvah, based on the Alter Rebbe's maimer. The maimer is about Levushe HaKayin, about Big Day Kohuna. And he says there that there are people by nature, they're the first on line when someone has to be punished. When the Torah says someone has to be punished, they're the first on line. Not because the Torah is saying so, it's because they're by nature achzarim, they're cruel people. So whenever something negative has to be done or said about somebody, they're right there. It looks like Kedusha because they're saying, hey, the Torah says so. But why are they not first on line when it comes to rewarding somebody? And of course, the idea of novel b'reshus HaTorah, to take your despicable behavior, your cruelty, your bitterness, your own inadequacy, and use Torah to say, you see, that person deserves, has nothing to do with Torah, has to do with you. So what does he say there in Ayin Beis? He says there's two types of isnasus. This is the words reimamus. One is a person who has a natural eminence, a natural majesty, a natural self-confidence. A person like that, he says, can tolerate anybody. Because they're not defined by my turf. Nobody's a threat to them. It's coming from within. But then there are people, he doesn't use the word insecurity, he says, but their only way of establishing authority is by being a presence. They have to command, impose. They don't command authority, they demand authority. And that's a person, he says, that doesn't have reim mosatzmi. It's not coming from within. It's coming from a state of insecurity. So therefore, you feel everybody's a threat to you. Like the Tzemach story with the Tzemach Tzedek, that someone came to the Tzemach Tzedek, says, people are stepping on me, people are insulting me. Tzemach Tzedek said, why do you spread yourself over the entire shul, that wherever somebody steps, they step on you? In other words, it's not about another person, it's about yourself. It's a hard thing to acknowledge that you're insecure. But the bottom line is judgmentalism is directly connected to insecurity. No one appointed us to be a judge over anybody, not God. Even Bezdin, their appointment is v'shaftu v'hitzilu ha'eda, is to judge and to save the nation, the community. And in general, the idea of judgmentalism is one of the most despicable midas. It comes from insecurity. So I suggest learn those chapters in Ayin Beis. I also suggest learn a mimer called Kisisa Eter, Tafresh Ayin from the Rebbe Rashab, where he also talks about immaturity, the immaturity of people who just look at things in very general terms. Gadlus HaMeichin, which means mature mind, comes from an effort. And when you have that, it generally allows you not to be so judgmental and not to be so intolerant and to be far more coexisting with others. To the point where you don't have to be wrong for me to be right. So this is a brief answer based on these maimorim that I just described. I'm going to talk about this some more in the next question, which touches upon this in other midas that people have. And this is the question about anger and bearing a grudge. The question, my friend insulted me and I cannot seem to get over it. We have moved on, but I am still bitter and holding a grudge. It's poisoning me. What can I do about it? I would feel stupid to rehash it since it happened so long ago, but it seems I need to address it internally. Any advice? Basically, how do we overcome a poisonous grudge? And we know people have grudges. Sometimes grudges, we carry them forever. Some people are that type that when you say something to them, they never forget. So what do we do about it? And I'm talking about the person who has the grudge. Obviously, there's a question, how does a person who someone has a grudge on, what do you do when someone else has a grudge on you? It's a different question, which I won't address now. But I want to connect it to another question, which is very much related. And this is about anger. A different form of another midah. So we talked about judgmentalism, which is also somewhat associated with jealousy. And now we'll talk about another, anger. I'm not a particularly angry person, but sometimes if I'm fighting with my children or spouse, I get viciously furious and mean. In these moments, I lash out and say things that are very painful that I later regret. How can I prevent myself from coming to that point? Another question, how do I channel my anger? Or as someone else put it, can a temper be tempered? Okay. Well, I'm sure many of you know, but if you don't know, you'll know now. Chassidus addresses this directly in a very simple but also brilliant way. So let's look into we don't have to go much farther than Tanya itself. The same chapter 12 that I referred to, the end of the chapter, talks about this directly, as well as section 25 in Ageres HaKedesh, which, as I point out, the Rebbe actually connects with end of chapter 12. So let's read a little Tanya here. I hope you don't mind. We'll read it in a personal, relevant way. I'll try to translate it, not the way we learned it as students, which often made it irrelevant simply because it was read in such a monotonous and seemingly irrelevant fashion. Let's read it in applying it to our lives. So here's what he says. So the end of chapter 12, the Alter Rebbe writes the following. After he talks about, we said, Hirhuri Aveda, inadvertent thoughts that are connected to matters between man and God, Ben Adam Lamokim, he says the same thing regarding negative thoughts from one person to another. V'chein bedvarim shebein Adam lechavere. Things from one person to another. Miyat, it says chavere, which means a friend. It can be a stranger, but chavere usually is a friend. Miyat she'eloi mahalev l'moyach. And instantaneously, as it pops up from the heart to the mind, any grudge and hatred to another, God forbid, or any jealousy, or kas, or anger, or kpeda. Actually, kpeda is more grudge. Tina is more of a negative, an ill feeling, and sina is hatred. He covers here the whole gamut. You have tina, sina, kina, kas, and kpeda. 5 things. A form of hatred or a type of like a negative thought about someone. Jealousy, anger, and grudge. Kpeda. V'daimehen. And things that are similar. So this includes the whole gamut of negative ill feelings to another. What does a person do? Einon mekablan klal. You can't control the pop-up thought. It's inadvertent. But you don't receive them willingly. You stop it. You say stop. Like I heard the Rebbe tell someone in Yechidus, when the Yetzer Hara comes to you, say to the Yetzer Hara, listen, I'm listening to what you say. I don't have time for you now. I have other things to do. You don't accept them in your mind and and your will and desire. So that's one thing, you don't accept them. But more than that. And on the contrary, the mind controls and dominates on the spirit and the heart, to do the exact opposite. Just like we read before that you go to the hepach mamish. You don't have only a power to stop a negative thought, you can actually focus on the opposite. And what does he suggest here? Something that most people would say is counterintuitive. You'd say, you know what? I won't have a grudge. But, I don't have to necessarily have a good feeling either. No, he says no. Lisnag im chavere, to behave with your friend. B'midas chesed, with love. V'chibi yeseda, and increasing affection. Meidasle, from the Chazal. Chibi yeseda meidasle. Lizbel mimenu, to tolerate from him ad k'tzei ha'achrin, to the furthest extreme. V'loi lichis chaz v'shalom, not to get angry. V'gam shalei l'shalom le'kifole. So in other words, he's not just saying in a case, you have a grudge that has no basis. Even if there's a basis to it, and you could justify it, you move your mind and your will to something opposite, you do good to the person, and you do not get angry, and you definitely don't repay him, God forbid, in kind. Ela adarabba. On the contrary, ligma l'chayovim tevis. Even l'chayovim, even though he's responsible and he did something that may deserve a reaction like you're having, you do good to him. He concludes chapter 12, like it says in Zeir, Lilmid, we should learn from Yosef and his brothers. Okay, so you'll say, very, very nice, it says in Tanya, but how do I apply it to myself? So let's focus on what means learning from Yosef and his brothers. So the Rebbe asks, why did we have to have this addition here? What would be missing if we just had L'chayovim Tevis? Because from Yosef and his brothers, the Rebbe says, we learn how to do this. What do we know by Yosef and his brothers? Because here he says that you could do it. But the question is, how do you do it? You have this terrible grudge, terrible temptation to repay someone in kind, and you're angry, and for good reason. How do you stop yourself? We understand that you could stop yourself, but what thought will help you stop yourself? So what do we learn from Yosef and his brothers? And this brings us to Ageres HaKedesh Siman Chafei. We learn the following. What happened there? The brothers were jealous. Kina. What did they do? They're about to kill him. Instead, they sold him into slavery. He ends up being 22 years, first in prison, suffering, and then he finally becomes the viceroy, Mishnah Lamelech. And what happens when they finally find out and they reconcile the reunion in Pasha Vayigash, the story with Yehuda, etc.? You'd think Yosef is in control and power. Look what he did. He first imprisoned Shimon, then he imprisoned Binyamin. You'd think Yosef is now going to get even. He deserves to. Look what they did to him. What did he do wrong? A little boy, 70-year-old boy, ripped away from his beloved father. For what? Because they were jealous over a dream. What does he do? He tells them, don't be afraid. Don't fear. Don't think that you did this to me. It's God that did this to me. In order for me to become the Mishnah Lamelech, to rise to power, so I could feed you, sustain you, and our father, and our family, and our nation. That's what Yosef did. Ma'avar al midesav. He did not react as a normal person would react. He overcame. He did exactly what it says here. He didn't let his grudge and his negative feelings, which I'm sure he could have had and justified to have. Remember, later we learn in Asari Haruge Malchus that when the 10 people, the decree that the Roman emperor says you should be killed for selling your brother into slavery, and what happens? They send up a shliach l'mayla, and he comes down and says the emperor is right. The emperor did it because he was a Rasha, a wicked person, but they had to accept the gzeira because it was correct. They did something really wrong. So we see it's a clearly big crime that they did. Later, the greatest would die for it. Yosef, however, not only controlled himself, he behaved ligma l'chayovim tevis. He did good with them. He sustained them. He gave them everything. They came down to Eretz Yisrael, gave them best of the land, and used his power to build the Jewish nation there until, of course, Golus Mitzrayim and the rest that would take place afterwards. How did Yosef have the power, the willpower, the presence of mind to do this? Because he realized, as he said, it came from Hashem. Don't think it came from you. Yes, they, ala nizik kvar nigzer min hashamayim, like he says in Chof Simon Chofei. So what does he say there in 25, Epistle 25 in Ageres HaKedesh? He says, Kol HaKedesh, anyone who gets angry is like idol worship. Why is it like idol worship? How could you compare idol worship to anger? Because anger means it's about me. You made me angry. I'm a mitzias, you made me angry. So you're worshiping yourself. Why don't you think that maybe God sent him as a shliach and this had to happen to you? And he runs right away. This doesn't justify what he did. He will get his day. He needs to get his punishment because Allah. But you, har b'shluchim l'makim, one way or another, God would have done this to you. The Rambam says similarly about Mitzrayim, that God told Avram Avinu that one day you'll be in a nation and enslaved by a nation that's not by people that's not your people. They will enslave you. So he asked the question, so then why were the Egyptians punished? God foresaw the whole thing. So there's the two opinions, the Rambam and the Ravid. Is it because they went more than necessary? Or is it because who asked you to do it? Every Yachid, God didn't say this Egyptian should do it, this one should do it. So on the person who does the crime or hurts you, he will get his day, but it's not your business. That's between him and God. the thing that happened to you, if you really believed in God and were not Eved Avodah Zarah, means self-worshipping, you would realize, listen, this had to happen to me. And in a way, you would even thank the person, whether you have to thank him in a letter or in an email or openly, that's another question. But in your mind, you thank the person for bringing me something, a lesson that God wanted to bring to me. That's what the Rebbe says. That's why he brings Yosef and Echav. Because Yosef teaches us, what did he say? That it comes from God. So Geras HaKedesh Simon Chav Hey, and together with chapter 12, come hand in hand about recognizing that when you have a grudge, or you have a sense of jealousy, or a sense of hatred, or anger, of course, naturally we all react that way, but pause. Maybe next time this happens, or even a grudge you're carrying right now, tonight or tomorrow morning, sit down, learn chapter 12, the end of chapter 12, open up a Geras HaKedesh Simon Chav Hey, open up Parsha Vayigash, and read a few psukim. What they did to Yosef is probably worse than most people, the things that have been done to us that we carry grudges for. And yet, Yosef recognized there's a higher purpose. Can we reach this level like a tzaddik? But like a Beinoni, we can. We can condition ourselves to think this way. And we can at least minimize, it's a divide and conquer. This isn't all or nothing. It's say, if I can't get rid of my entire grudge, I can't get rid of my entire anger, I shouldn't try? Absolutely not. That's part of the Yetzer Hara's efforts by saying, since you can't get rid of anyway, you might as well have the grudge. You divide and conquer. It's like untangling something. Untangle that which is in your power, and then you'll see what's left that is more difficult to untangle. And you have direct direction of psychological insight straight from Tanya, how to focus on what happened to you and not focus on the other individual. It's difficult because we want to get even. We want that person to get what they deserve. Look what they did. So it's difficult, but it's all about, do you have a relationship with God? Do you have a relationship with transcending that feeling by recognizing there's a higher purpose? And when I invoke God here, I don't mean necessarily in a religious sense. I mean invoking transcend. Are you going to become a petty person that everything that happens to you, you always have a scapegoat and someone to blame? Even when it's justified, like he says here, rise higher, because you become a greater person. It's similar to what we said before about Hesach Hadas. When a person has a temptation, focusing on it or focusing on the tikkun means you're being schlepped by it. You become a victim, and that valuable real estate called your mind becomes controlled by that thought or by someone else who did something to you. You have valuable real estate. Use it well. Take it, and don't let it become a victim to the person who did something to you or to the temptation that you have. Rise. Forget about yourself. Think about your cause. Think about your calling. How much time and energy and how much of that real estate is preoccupied and occupied by foreign forces? Think about that. Is that what you want? You want someone, an alien force, to be occupying your mind, your heart? You're being consumed, subsumed, obsessed? The pride of a person should say, I want my mind to go where I want it to go, not where somebody who did something to me is controlling it to go. Which in general is a lesson about all negative things that happen to us. I want to just add something because I didn't really spell it out. The Ritzeni Shebemechi that I wanted to add, Yesh Leime B'derech Efsher, is that if Tainug, that pleasure, I go back to the point of pleasure, is rooted in Atik, and that is what shifts and allows you to overcome the pleasure for negative things, then that's the Ritzeni Shebem. It's not just Meich Shalat HaLev. The Zohar says Meich Shalat HaLev, the Zohar Pinchas. The Alter Rebbe adds Ritzeni Shebemechi, Keser Shebemechi in the language of Kabbalah. And Primis HaKeser is Tainug. That ultimately, when you touch that part, which is of course a far deeper level, it's more than just the mind controlling the heart. You're actually rewiring it from the engine room, which is relevant both to temptations Ben Odin Lamokim and also Ben Odin L'Chavera, as we just discussed. So this also answers the question about, can the mind truly rewire the heart? And can your smile change your feelings? Two questions that were posed to us. The answer is absolutely. The mind, Meich Shalat HaLev, as we know, has two meanings to it. The mind can control an emotion. For example, you think about something, you can begin to be attracted to it. The second interpretation is that the mind can control an emotion, not to allow an impulse to control your life. So either way, the mind has that power. But when you think of the mind, as he says, that big Chidush Nifla, which I want to say from Ayin Beis, is based really on Alter Rebbe's Maimer, in Tov Kuf Samaches, Bolok, an explanation of a Zohar, Ki Asisa Pella, The Alter Rebbe explains that pleasure and chachma is really pleasure. So therefore, wisdom, mind, has the power that comes from a far deeper place that actually can rewire who we are. So when we say moyach shalat alev, that it's not an acquired skill, it's an inherent one, an innate force inside of us, absolutely has the power to rewire our feelings. And again, I want to use a secular example. Let's take a soldier in an army, and let's take a tennis player, or any sports. Someone who's very talented, until they're not trained, they don't have necessarily the instincts. You train someone long enough doing something, and suddenly they get instincts that when they're in the position, when push comes to shove, they will have instincts that another person will not have. And that's not purely skill. It's training, it's conditioning. So training and conditioning teaches a person to impulsively just react differently than he would have naturally reacted. If we took Chassidus and Avodas Hashem as seriously lahavdil, as some sports people take their sports, or soldiers in army, or business people in business, or different people in different disciplines, musicians, artists, actors, and so on, we would be able to relate to all these things. Doing that, the time is short, and I wanted to touch upon doing the fact that Chav Zayin Adar is this week, this end of this week. So I want to just add something regarding the 22 years since the Rebbe suffered a stroke. So we have a number of questions that people asked us that I'd like to address. I'll try to do it in the time that allows us, and if need be, we'll continue. Did the Rebbe know that 20 years after Gimmel Tammuz, Moshiach will still not be here? Was the Moshiach campaign a go for broke project? Did the Rebbe tell us Moshiach is almost here, so he will try harder and hopefully bring him? Did the Rebbe consider the letdown and maybe even the yush that 20 years and after Gimmel Tammuz and Moshiach is not here? Another question. When the struggle of our generation is ignorance and apathy, as opposed to Umas Ha'elam wanting to exterminate us for our belief, what are the concrete baby steps need to be taken in order to constantly play on a Mesiras Nefesh level and keep it up till we cross the threshold of redemption? It's another question. It's almost 20 years. This Golus is way too painful for me to handle. If the Rebbe was frustrated with Mashiach not coming, how can we possibly bring him? My children too are confused. I keep on telling them Mashiach is coming and he just doesn't come. What should I tell my children who are confused? How do I handle the disappointment that Mashiach is not here 20 years after Gimmel Tammuz? Okay, it's a painful subject to discuss, but needs to be discussed. And we shall do so, as I said, with the time allotted. I remember vividly the Monday night, the dark Monday night, when the Rebbe suffered the stroke. It affected us all, and particularly it affected myself. I lost my job because I was busy working in Sichas. That's what I did all the time. And now the Rebbe stopped speaking. 2 years later, to the day Chav Zayin Adar, was the second stroke, and then came Gimmel Tammuz. Till this day, this remains one of these mysteries. But one thing we've been trained by the Rebbe: there's no such thing as hopeless. There's no such thing as letting ourselves become resigned. And the language of some of these questions is a language that goes counter to everything that the Rebbe trained us to be. We are not victims. Though Jews have suffered throughout history, we've never become sufferers. In the worst of times, we picked ourselves up and we moved forward. After the Holocaust, everyone wrote the obituary of the Jewish people and said within 20, 30, 40 years, there won't be any Jews left. That obituary has been written a number of times. Yet we're here. So yes, in a mini way, it's a mini Holocaust for Chassidim when we talk about Gimmel Tammuz in some ways. And nevertheless, we may not know why, and we may never know why. But we know one thing is for sure. We forge ahead, we're adults, and we take the bull by the horns, and we believe firmly, the same Rebbe that we believed in before Gimmel Tammuz, before Chav Zayin Adar. Every word he said, like every Rebbe, is a Dover Nitzchi. A Rebbe is a Rebbe. Whether it works on your terms or not, is not relevant. I remember when the Rebbe had a heart attack in Tov Shalamet Ches. I was a Bacher in Yeshiva, 770. It was my heyday. I was working in the Siches, I was working in Sefer Lekutim, Tzemach Tzedek Encyclopedia, top of the world. The Rebbe was in full glory. And then came the heart attack the night of Shmini Atzeres during Hakofis. And I had my little crisis internally. It's a public confession here. Chatosi ani maskir, as they say. I had my little crisis. Those days, things were not said in grubber ways that things are spoken about today. But internally, I thought to myself, here so many people are putting their lives on the line, going on shlichus, committing their whole lives to the Rebbe's mission, to the mission of bringing Moshiach, the Der Hashvi, the things the Rebbe said in Bas Ligani, Tovshin Yad Aleph, that this is the last generation of Golas, first generation of Gula. And here, God forbid, what happens if there's a Gimmel Tammuz? That was not the language I used. And we didn't talk about these things. And then I remember reading, today it's in the Rishimas, the story with Shmuel Munkus, the famous story. Shmuel Munkus, the Chassid of the Alter Rebbe. So the full story goes, today we have the details, the Rebbe writes it in his manuscripts and Rishimas, his journals, that they came to arrest the Alter Rebbe for Yutas Kislev, we know that. It was the middle of the night, the Alter Rebbe had a hiding place that in case anyone came for him, he would be able to escape from the back door, like a basement or some cellar door, trap door. He came in the middle of the night, and the Alter Rebbe hid. The soldiers came in looking, where's the Alter Rebbe? The Alter Rebbetzin, the Alter Rebbe's Rebbetzin says she doesn't know where he is. The way the Rishima goes, they slapped her, they knocked out a tooth. That's the way the story goes. They left, the Alter Rebbe came out of his hiding place, and a few minutes later, they hear a knock on the window again. And they got frightened. Who is it? Shmuel Munkus. Clearly Shmuel Munkus was this night person. The first time he comes to the Alter Rebbe was also at night. The famous story where he says, my goy is stronger than your goy. So he comes to the Alter Rebbe opens the door and says, you also come at night, which means you're also frightening us. So he answered to the Alter Rebbe, I didn't know that by the Rebbe there's a night, meaning that he has something to be afraid of. And then the Alter Rebbe consulted with him, should I cooperate and allow myself to be arrested? So he said the famous lines, and I remember reading it then. He said, either or. Abe, you're a Rebbe. If you're a Rebbe, then what are you afraid of? Like he said, what are you afraid of the night? And if you're not a Rebbe, you deserve, and this is taken out from the Rishima, but I'll say it, a bullet in your head for taking away the pleasure from so many Chassidim or so many Eden, so many Jews. As a chassid that a person can speak that way to a Rebbe is itself quite amazing. I guess Shmuel Munkus had that ability. But that struck me, that's exactly the story. Rebbe, it's not in your terms. Just a Rebbe is only a Rebbe when things are going well and you have answers to all your questions and we're riding high and we see the Rebbe and dance with him. A Rebbe is a Rebbe, he's a Rebbe. And I remember saying to myself then in Tavshin Lamed Ches, in 1977 it was, Simchas Torah time, that grow up, become an adult, and make a decision. If he's a Rebbe no matter what. Even if it doesn't work exactly according to your script. And if he's not, God forbid, then don't just be around when everything is nice, when the party is good. So then get out. And I made my decision. This doesn't mean it's easy. We have to be adults, and we have to tell our children there are many questions in life. And trust me, these are not the only questions. There are other questions. But we are dedicated to what is emes. Make a decision. It's not just always going to be on our terms. Sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't be. Real decisions in life means there's a commitment and you're in. You're in, you mobilize yourself, and we do whatever is possible. Every word the Rebbe said, if he's a Rebbe, and I say only if, using that language, then it's all nitzchi. People gave their lives, they put themselves on lives. If the Rebbe said to you, and all the doctors said, don't make an operation, and the Rebbe said not, people would do life and death. That same nitzchi is that same eternity. Not because the Rebbe, because it's Shechina Medaberes Meteich Gleini, you're talking about a godly man, and he said in the first Maimer, not later, that this is the last generation, seventh generation. You understand? Fine. You don't understand? Also fine. You're in all the way. And yes, 20 years have passed. Very painful to say that. But the question is, what have we done? Are we going to throw it back on the Rebbe? The Rebbe is maybe waiting for us to make that move. That's how I look at it. Look at yourself. Why are you looking at others? Why are you looking at the Rebbe even? That is the approach the Rebbe trained us to be. And that is why not one shliach and not one shlucha Anyone committed has quit. We have questions, but we were trained to be adults. An adult means you're in and you go all the way. And yes, you're ready to take that so-called risk if necessary. Because that's what emes is. And if we were living in times of Avram Avinu, you could say, hey, too risky. But 3,500 years of history testify that this attitude has worked. So why should we doubt that it's not possible? And there's no way that we don't get closer to Mashiach because the clock only goes one direction. It can't go backwards. So I say to all of us, to myself and to all of us, Chav Zayin Adar, it's a painful day. So is Gimmel Tammuz. But nevertheless, we are blessed to have a Rebbe like this in our midst. We have a Tanya. We have 7 generations of Chassidus. We have the Rebbe leaving us directives in every area of life. Yes, today we have to be adults. It was a lot nicer when the Rebbe carried us on his wings, and our cracks were not so obvious. Our blemishes were not so obvious because of the great light. And now, you have to stand up and be a man or a woman, an adult, and what are you going to do? Tell me what you're going to do when I'm not carrying you on my shoulders, at least in a revealed way. So there's no question we have the blessings of the Rebbe and we stand in the Rebbe's power and force. But now, the question is going to be, what are you going to do? Are you in or you're out? Is it enough to just have a picture of the Rebbe on your wall and say, I'm a Chabad Chassid and I sing Chabad Nigunim and I do Chabad Nusach? Or are you a soldier dedicated to the war that the Rebbe initiated? What war? The war against apathy and against ignorance. And it takes people to take an initiative, proactive. We can't be watching people, watch people. Observant Jew, observing others. We are proactive. As they say in the media world, there are people who make things happen, people who watch things happen, who people ask, what happened? Are we going to be people who make things happen? This has been episode 7 of MyLife, Chassidus Applied. Everyone should have a very good week, an empowering week. And please continue to send in your questions at an anonymous form that we have, which is meaningfullife.com/MyLifeLive. And again, the questions that have been asked to me, especially the ones I did not directly answer, but are timely and even urgent, please contact me at simon@meaningfullife.com. This has been Simon Jacobson, My Life, Chassidus Applied, episode 7. Thank you very much.